My name is Leila Shukroun. I'm Professor of International Law and Director of the University of Portsmouth Thematic Initiative in Democratic Citizenship. Today, I feel extremely privileged and equally delighted to welcome our colleague from Oxford, Professor Danny Dorling. Danny joined the School of Geography and the Environment in 2013 to take up the Hartford Mackinder Professorship in Geography. He was previously a professor of geography at the University of Sheffield. He also worked in Newcastle, Bristol, Leeds, and New Zealand. He's very prolific as an author. He's the author of a superb scholarship in geography, but I must say it's very interdisciplinary, really. He's written a large number of books. Just let me give you a number of titles: The Atlas of the Real World, Mapping the Way We Live, Bankrupt Britain, An Atlas of Social Change, Rule Britannica, Brexit and the End of Empire, Fintopia, What We Can Learn from the World's Happiest Country. I'm sure you see once in a while Danny's op-eds in the news, in the media, and we are going to discuss today his latest book, Slow Down. His work is touching upon a very vast area of topics from health, inequality, housing, poverty, and indeed today in the context of the COVID, but really not directly related to it because his book was written before, the idea of possibly slowing down. So let me remind you a few rules. You have to keep your mic muted. And as far as the questions at the end of Danny's speech are concerned, I'd like to invite you to write your question in the chat box. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there is an icon for the chat box. So please write down your question there. I'll read them out to Danny when he's ready with his presentation, when his presentation is done. Right, so thank you very much again, everyone. I'm extremely delighted and again excited to welcome our colleague Danny Dorling from Oxford University. So without further ado, Danny, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Leila. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk about this book and these ideas. I began writing the Slowdown book almost 7 years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago. And it's a book about trends and change over time. I wrote it because I had previously written about population, and many people know that population is slowing down. And I'm going to show you quite a lot of graphs of that. But I wondered what was speeding up. And so I whenever I had any spare time, I would collect some more data and look at trends in all aspects of human life that we measure worldwide, so that limits it, that the quality of the data is fairly good for, because you can't look at changes over time without having high quality data. Otherwise, what you see are errors. Things suddenly change, but they really don't. I've got a PowerPoint. I promise this will be less than half an hour, but I'm going to put that on now because it's easier for me to talk through that. So with luck, you will see some slides there. Great. The subtitle of the book is the end of the Great Acceleration and why it's good for the planet, the economy, and our lives, which seems ironic now, given the enormous end to accelerations that we're currently living through. I should say the book was put to bed on I think it was about the 15th of January. So the very last changes to the text were made and it was sent off to be printed before we knew about COVID at all. But it was obvious to me by that point that there was hardly anything which was still speeding up of those things that we choose to measure. Let me show you how I look at this. So with luck, you've got a new slide. This is a conventional graph of the population of the planet from 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago to now. And it's a graph that's often used to scare school children and university children. it also suggests that we're now into out of control population acceleration. Everything is going to end as we get more and more people. Somebody has very kindly added the Black Death and the Plague at one point to show a sort of small reduction. And also, I think, to kind of give an image of doom as we head towards 8 billion people. And the implication is it's going to go up and up and up. So that's a conventional way of looking at change over time. Now, I look at it differently. What I do is, rather than having time along the x-axis of a graph, I put the rate of change along the x-axis of a graph. And I put the thing that you're measuring along the y, the vertical axis, as you normally do. So this is an imaginary country. And in this country, you're seeing the population going up and up. But it's not just rising, it's actually rising by 2% every year. And that's an acceleration. That means that this country by the 1980s was adding 4 million people to the population a year. Population was 200 million. By around about 2005, it got to 300 million. It's adding 6 million a year. And by now, it's adding 8 million a year. It's got up to 400 million. So that's what acceleration looks like. That's the kind of change you expect if there is a constant proportional increase, not an absolute increase, a constant proportional increase. And 2% population growth is what the world had actually reached around about 1968, 1969, the fastest relative growth that human species has ever achieved worldwide. So that's an image for you of acceleration. That's what acceleration looks like on these kind of graphs. And here's deceleration. Same country, starts at 2% growth a year, but then that drops to 1.9, 1.8, 1.7, 1.6% growth a year. By 1970, it's falling. That fall goes faster and faster, but in absolute terms, it's less people because you're running out of people. This is a kind of children of men graph. It's a kind of, what would it look like if the population completely disappeared? How could that happen? And so here's deceleration for you. And I have to show you these things because the graphs are weird. They're used commonly in social science in Japan. I haven't invented them, but they're not used in social science in Britain. It's easier now than it was a few months ago to talk about acceleration and deceleration. You all know now what it feels like when something is going up and going up faster and faster, because that is in effect what was happening at the start of this pandemic in February and in March. And you know why it really matters if something is accelerating, you know how scary it is, and you know the sense of relief when it's still going up but not going up as fast. Okay, so I don't have to explain these things as much as I had to do before what we've just, well, we're still going through it, but gone through. Okay, some real data. So remember I said I started this off thinking I want to look at those things which are decelerating and those things which are accelerating. And one of the things that I was fairly sure would be still accelerating was student debt. Here's student debt in the United States. And the reason I thought student debt would be accelerating is when I was younger, I used to go on Occupy protests. And one of the posters on the Occupy protest was the ballooning US student debt poster, just showing it getting bigger and bigger. It's going to be completely out of control, which was true until July 2009. And then you'll see the slope of this graph changes. It's leaning towards the left. Every October, it hits a little peak because that's when the students go to university normally. And they still will, the undergraduates at least this year. But you see that it begins to lean in a different direction, still rising. Every year, student debt in the US and the UK is still rising. But from 2009 onwards, shortly after the financial crash, it began to rise less. And it's a mixture of the increase in fees stopped accelerating, the number of students going to university in the United States also stopped accelerating. So there's one of the things that I thought was getting faster that wasn't. And of course, many things, you can't all get faster all the time. Here's another one that I thought was just going to be going up and up and up. I made many attempts to measure big data. And I'm a cynic. And I was a nerd when I was young. I probably am still a nerd. So when I did my PhD, 1989, 1990, I had 280 magnetic tapes with the entire share registry of Britain on. That was big data. That was 1989, 1990. This is Wikipedia, the growth of Wikipedia, which you can see accelerating from the beginning of Wikipedia, 2001, 2, 3, 4, 2006, until 2007. Entries in Wikipedia keep on rising after 2007, but not rising at an accelerating rate. We get another little acceleration 2015-16 as stubs were added, but there is only so much useful information that you can have. Wikipedia stops growing faster and faster. There comes a point when there are no longer things to be added that many people are going to look up. And it's the same with data worldwide. We have about 8 billion pieces of information recorded for every one of the almost 8 billion of us. There aren't 8 billion interesting things about any of us. It's ridiculous. Anyway, that's one on data. Something else which is accelerating, there are about 4 or 5 things that we measure that are accelerating. And the most important one is emissions, which were doubling every 23 years. Our carbon emissions worldwide, they're now doubling every 20, they were doubling every 22, they're now doubling every 23. And you'll see it varies, but by 2018, which is the latest data I have, it's moving to the right again. So the problem isn't just that we're emitting 15 or by 1981, 20 billion tons of CO2 a year. It's that the amount we're emitting is rising by year 2025 billion tons a year, 30 billion by 2006, 35 billion by 2015. It's that the actual increase between those years is bigger and bigger and bigger, and it just looks totally out of control. And the really sad thing, and this graph highlights the nuances, this way of graphing, is that every time we do something like the Rio Earth Summit or the Kyoto Protocol, or even the Paris Climate Agreement, it's as if we kind of go, well done, we've done that now, that's great. And then the years immediately afterwards, we get an acceleration in emissions. I mean, it may just be coincidences. It's got a lot to do with the economy and recessions, but there is something which is accelerating. Acceleration is rare. That acceleration has to end, but that acceleration at the moment, apart from the effects of the pandemic, doesn't show a great degree of deceleration to come. It all depends whether we actually go out and buy all those clothes that they try to sell us for very small amounts of money when they open up the shops, or if we decide we're not going to, we just buy clothes if we need them. That's the kind of way this will decelerate or not decelerate. Here's a conventional graph. If you're wondering, why is he drawing these weird graphs? It's because almost none of that nuance that you just saw can be seen in the conventional graph. This is exactly the same data. It shows emissions going up over time, but you have to look and go, oh yes, the graph's slightly steeper now, so that's accelerating. You have to compare the slopes of the curves. It's not easy to do. Whereas if you're getting obsessed, as you can tell I am, with are we hitting turning points? Are things changing? And it's the speed of change that really matters. We've been told repeatedly that things are going faster and faster and faster. The people who tell us that almost never actually give you any examples of what it is. They could have emissions. This is something going faster and faster. I've read quite a few books on acceleration. If you're going to write a book on slowdown, it makes sense to read books on acceleration. And what's interesting is they often have a lot of theory in them, but they don't have many practical examples. And my favourite book, which I do quote in Slowdown, but I won't tell you which it is one where they talk about how everything's going faster and faster. And then one of the first examples they give is the speed at which people speak in the Norwegian Parliament. And if that's the example you're having to pull out to show that everything's going faster and faster, it shows that you really have to look around quite a lot to find an example of something going faster. But here's one with emissions. Why do emissions matter? Because of surface land temperature. More complicated, doesn't simply follow directly. And in recessions, in wartime, you can actually have a period at which temperatures don't rise. 1980s was a global recession at the start, 1990 a global recession, 2008 and 2009 a global recession. And of course now we're entering a global recession. But That graph, particularly after the 1980s, is leaning to the right. So that's the acceleration in temperature. Not just 1 degree above average, but rising by a higher number of tenths of a degree each year than the year before. That's what it was doing. And like I say, it was rare to get an acceleration. What population? If you remember the graphs I showed you at the beginning, the conventional graphs, they look very scary. This doesn't. This looks very different. Same data, going up to 6 billion people by just before 2000, 7 billion and 8. Then we're heading past 9 at 2040, possibly 10 at 2060. But you'll see that that little dot is moving towards zero growth. This is UN data from 2017. The UN data from 2019 was even more conservative, said actually we'll stop growing earlier. And many people criticize UN data. Why am I showing you this? Because people say there are too many people, the reason for all the pollution is too many of us and it's going up and up and up. No, our numbers have only been going, but by about the 1980s, they begin to rise by just 80 million each year. Not 80, 85, 90, 100 million, 80 each year. The 1990s is the end of the absolute rise, being bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're beginning to see falls. Now, because I run out of time, I'm going to show you a number of these for different countries quite quickly. But first of all, I'm going to change the axis on this to a log axis, I think, because it highlights what's happened in the past, because you might be wondering how unusual are our times today. So here we've got the same graph, but with a log axis. On both axes, it's logged, and this helps see what was really important. We've just entered the 1820s, 1830s, 1850s, when the speed of population rise last slowed down. That, the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, that I think was colonialism. That's imperialism. That's invading dozens and dozens of countries, upsetting social systems. It has an effect initially of slowing down the rate of growth. But by 1850, you've unleashed something. You've destroyed the ways in which different cultures keep themselves stable, and you have a global population boom, which now we're seeing the end of. If you're wondering about the earlier one, what happened shortly before 1500, that's 1492. That's what happens if you take 3 small ships and turn up in the Americas with your germs. And again, you see a dip. So the previous ones are plague, famine, disease, war, conquest, or horses of the apocalypse. And this one is women taking control of their lives. Very different. It's not just women taking control of their lives, but it's contraception, smaller families, education, not due to terrible disasters. And I should say at this point, the current pandemic will not alter this visibly at all. 99.3, maybe 99.5% of people who die in the world this year will not die of COVID. Global life expectancy will continue to rise this year as fast as it would have done anyway, possibly even faster if we care for each other a bit more than we were. So different countries. The United States is the most out of control country in the Americas. It's the only one which is looking at continued population growth of this kind of size after 2030. There are lots of interesting kind of nuances as to why in 1997 did population growth peak as much, but that is particularly interesting. But anyway, even in the United States, the fastest growth rate in the Americas is slowing down. And if it gets an almighty economic recession, it'll slow down faster because people don't move to a country where there are not opportunities to work. Here's China. That's the Opium Wars. Just to give you an example of one of the things that we were involved in back then. And you see the population accelerating to 1968, one-child policy, although that wasn't as important as the general reduction from having 6 children to 2 that occurred before. And then this almighty fall in population to come into China, very different. The whole of Africa, which people often say, but what about Africa? The interesting thing of Africa, is that the acceleration that happened in the 80s, which adds an extra billion people, happened, I think, because of structural adjustment. Well, not just I think, people have written papers on it, saying, and some papers only released in February last year, saying if you introduce structural adjustment, which means that girls in particular can't go to secondary school in the 1980s in many countries in Africa, then it's not surprising you don't see fertility fall as fast as it was falling, and hence we have a slightly higher end population. But even this may be an overestimate. Britain, tiny place, it really doesn't matter. Less than 1% of the world's population, well less than 0.5% of the world's children. But of course we're here, so it's interesting. You can see the First World War there, the Second World War there. And you can see back, because I've included Ireland, all of Ireland, you can see the famine, and the equivalent to the famine, 2008, is actually the net effect of A8 migration, which, if you invite people to come, which Britain's done numerous times, we invited them to come, we're coming up to it now in the 1960s, and you'll see a little increase to 1965, that was Enoch Powell saying, please can you come? If you invite people to come, and to Ireland, 2003, 4, 5 to 8, you get that increase. And that is the projected growth. India, which is important, unlike Britain, in terms of people. Look at the incredible slowdown in India. And this is India plus Bangladesh plus Pakistan, because it's a long-term population series. Projected at the moment to peak by 2064, will possibly peak in terms of population earlier. The human species has never stopped growing since we became a species. So slowdown is really interesting. I've got to go forward because it's not just about population, but here's Japan. And of course, the Second World War in 1945, and then the baby boom post-war. But now the most incredible slowing in Japan, already well underway. So it was 2010 that we hit peak population, and you'll see it plummeting downwards as projected. Incidentally, my colleague in Japan just sent me an email half an hour ago telling me he hasn't seen his wife and children for weeks and weeks and weeks because he's not allowed to travel back from his university in the north to go home, because that's the kind of lockdown they have in Japan. The rest of Eurasia, and again it's the same pattern, so I won't even let the dot get to the end this time. It's just to show I'm not cheating and picking particular countries to make slowdown more obvious. That's all of Eurasia apart from China, India, Britain and Japan. Oceania, in case we forget it, tiny numbers of people. The big increases, by the way, early on, all about gold rushes, but it's almost impossible to predict Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands in the future, by the way. That's a silly curve that you end up drawing when they have or something. We just don't know. The Americas, where you take the United States out, if you can remember that United States graph of just going up and up and up, this is, people don't realize that the US has the highest fertility rate in all of the Americas. Brazil is much lower. So the Americans are having set to peak in 40 years from now. And you'll be bored of these now, but it's all about fertility falling. This is the world showing it falling. This is the United States, and then in depth for the United States. You can see I'm obsessive about data. I look and look, try to see what's going on. China, fertility actually rising a tiny bit at the moment, but so minuscule, 1.6 children per couple, it will make no difference. Niger, the data is a straight line with the World Bank in this case. I'm really having to guess an estimate, but the biggest falls in fertility are in the places with the highest fertility right now. So we're in an incredible time. The more detailed diagram shows you what's in the actual book. So I can put in more detail than you can put on a slide. Places that have had invasions, where things have gone terribly wrong, where there are civil wars, East Timor and Guatemala. Even there, you're seeing fertility in the case of East Timor plummeting from 5.5 children per couple right down in Guatemala, despite decades of internal strife and strife arranged from outside, just 3 children born in Guatemala. Haiti. And again, and a lot of this is very recent. So I'm not being clever about this. If you look at Haiti, it's really only since the late 90s that you can actually say, oh yes, something really dramatic has changed, and the fertility has actually gone down. Just comparing it to France, there are different patterns. The drop now is far faster. I should have taken France right back to when fertility was 4 or 5 children born in France to show how much slower the fertility drop in the past in France was. UK for completion, and South Korea, which is much more interesting. South Korea is now at 0.99 children per couple, less than 1, halving population numbers every year. In case you're getting bored, we've put the national birds of each country on. Portugal, Brazil, and as I mentioned Brazil earlier, plummeting to 1.3, I think, children per couple at a particular low point, higher by 2016, but definitely not going up again. Finally, we got away from population. I've got about a dozen left to show you. We've got 5 minutes. I'll be really quick. Other things. Inventions peaked in the 1930s. That's a number of new uses of electricity, low-hanging fruit, the time of real change and inventions. We're told that things are changing now, but just think about what your grandparents saw as they saw the first tractors in the fields at the start of the last century, as they saw motor cars arrive, as they saw planes take off, as they saw us land on the moon. And I'm afraid your life has been a lot more boring, which is a simple way of looking at technological change. GDP growth, I'll show you if you log it in the next graph. Let's go to that. It's actually 1950s with the highest rate of GDP growth. That's the kind of time of Americans getting cars, getting larger houses. And if you look at that graph there, you'll see that it's sloping leftwards from the 1950s onwards. Now, always we say with GDP growth, it's particular events. We say it was the oil crash in the 1970s. We say it was the global recession of the early 80s. We say it's the great crash of 2008, and we'll say it's COVID. But the general trend is a slowing down. There'll always be particular events that you will blame for that slowing down, but it is slowing down. Let's look at what else is happening. In terms of these things we can measure, there are other things probably speeding up that we don't measure. China. I don't need to tell you what's happened to Chinese GDP now. In fact, there isn't even a target for it. I think they announced yesterday or the day before they don't even have a target for the growth of GDP. But long before the pandemic, China's GDP was slowing down. The increase was less and less. The Nasdaq. Here's an example of something that looked to be accelerating out of control. If you were a share trader in the 1980s, all you just had to do is hold on to shares in the Nasdaq, and then you'll see this enormous acceleration in the 90s, and you'll just make a lot of money. But go forward, take that forward from 1996, and you'll see it gets more precarious. That's the dot-com bubble bursting, which is a double loop, like a roller coaster in these kind of graphs. These graphs don't let you predict the future. I should just point this out. You can look at them and think you can predict the future. So you can have a look and think that, oh, I know what's going to happen after 2009, but you really can't. And of course, it's absolutely crashed and then gone up again very fast. Only a couple left now. I really have tried to measure lots and lots and lots of things. Human heights. They aren't actually falling worldwide. It looks like it's falling, but that's because the mix of people on the planet is changing. So people who are generally shorter are having more babies. But human height is no longer growing at the rate it was growing anywhere. It's sort of further evidence something has happened. It involved us at the start of the last century, from the 1920s, 1930s, you can see here, growing at the fastest rates that we saw increased growth. You know we've grown because if you have children or parents, you will be several centimetres taller than your parents on average, and your children will be taller than you. That's coming to an end. We've got to begin to ask Two more things that were accelerating. University graduates worldwide, particularly international students, weren't just rising, they were rising at a greater number each year. This data only ended in 2014. This one had to slow down. We knew it had to slow down because it's a proportion of young people, and you can't go above 100% of young people going to university. It'd be quite nice to get to near 100%, just like secondary school for the future. But there's one of the few things we're accelerating. Here's something that was decelerating, luckily. The extinction of species. It was accelerating up until 1984, and then it decelerated, only because we ran out of the really easy species to kill on small islands. And if it hadn't decelerated, we'd all be dead. 100% of species. It's not a great story, but just for completeness, it's there. Here's the last one I'm going to show you of an acceleration, and it's particularly telling at the moment, of course. This isn't people, this is air passengers. So it was passing 4 billion by 2017, not just going up, but going up more and more each year. Not more people flying, roughly the same number of people flying more often, people like me. That was completely and utterly out of control. Something would have stopped it or slowed it down. It always does. If something happens to be COVID-19, the great danger of flying is not crashing. Flying is very safe when it comes to crashing. The great danger of flying is sharing the air with another 400 people for a number of hours in a tube, which we always should have known anyway. Flying will reduce in future because the cost of flying will reduce, because will increase. Because as you get fewer people flying, it costs more to put every person in the air. Babies, of course, are slowing down. The point I'm trying to make in this book is we've only just come out of this enormous acceleration. This period, 50s, 60s, 70s, where everything was changing so fast, and then suddenly it comes to a halt. But that sudden coming to a halt was accumulation of various decelerations over the course of the last century in different ways. And there's a particular number of babies falling. I'm hoping this is the last one, because I know it's been too much for you, but I was just trying to give you an idea. Life expectancy, still rising, but not rising as quickly as it was in the 60s and 70s, mainly due to plummeting infant mortality then. Infant mortality fell the most, fastest in 2010. This projection isn't going to happen. It's not going to rise like that suddenly. It's not going to fall, but we're heading towards some kind of age stability. Just descriptive, it's what the data suggests if you look at it in this way. My last graph, Layla, you'll be glad to know, this is the last one. As I said at the beginning, that these graphs have been used by social scientists in Japan since the 1970s. This particular one is complicated. Don't worry if you don't understand it. It's about the rate of suburbanization and the building of skyscrapers in Tokyo. And the important thing is it ends up in the middle as things stop changing that much in Tokyo. So Tokyo in Japan is a good example of a slowing down place where there was enormous change in the 1930s and 40s and 1950s and 60s, and eventually you get a steady state appearing. The graphs are called phase diagrams. They're used for describing things like a pendulum. That's what a pendulum slowing down looks like on a phase diagram. So I'm just trying to get an idea of the speed of change. And all I'm making, well, I make other claims in the book, because of course you do, because you get licensed to, but all I'm really claiming is so many things are slowing down, we have to begin to accept that we're in a period of slowdown. And we were before the pandemic hit, and we will be again. And the only thing I say about pandemics in the book, I have a section on 1917, 1918, and some other ones, is that all previous pandemics hit, modern pandemics, in a period of acceleration. And they had almost no effect on economic growth or much else. That's the 1918, the 1951, 57, 1968, 69 global pandemics. You won't have heard the other three because we largely ignored them. Thank you ever so much. That's my last slide. For letting me waffle on. It's just over half an hour. I'm really looking forward to your questions, and I'm just about to press stop sharing on my screen. And that's worked.
Thank you ever so much, Danny. I think that was absolutely fascinating. I see that we have a number of questions already in the chat box. I'm going to read all that to you. Fascinating, and I believe people do realize that there is a lot of research in there actually, because for you to be able to come up with those visually striking graphs, which are quite different from what we see generally, it means that you've done so much research and you've managed to conceptualize and put in place a different system, although you modestly say that certain things existed already in Japan particularly, but I'm sure this has taken massive amount of your time. Don't know whether you've been slowing down yourself so much, but it's really very, very interesting. We have geographer with us, so I'm sure they are going to ask questions in terms of research and methodology. I'd like to ask the first question, if you don't mind, and use my rights as a chair. Don't you think, and I'm playing the devil's advocate, and I'm sure you've heard that before, but don't you think it's a little bit like, you know, the white man privilege to say, or to, I don't know whether you're encouraging people, but to say that we are slowing down when you know that you have 1 in 3 people globally who do not have access to safe water, for example, you have 4.2 billion people who do not have safely managed sanitation services, 3 billion basic hand washing facilities, to talk about something we've discussed so much at the moment. Obviously, you know, I know you're not saying that, but that was just to play a little bit the devil's advocate. That's the first question, and then we have many more.
Yes. It's the argument is it's not saying that we've got to a level which is fine. It's that a slowdown is underway, and it is really a kind of it's saying that something that was happening is no longer happening as much. One of the reasons for mass world poverty was the growth of inequality worldwide. And the growth of inequality worldwide grew fastest in this period of acceleration. And that then leaves people in this terrible situation where a third of the planet are living in poverty, which is abject. It's really annoying when economists try and claim it isn't as bad as it was before, because it certainly feels as bad as it was before to people if you ask them. But the argument is that the acceleration increased these divisions and made these things worse. The slowdown allows you to address these problems better than you were addressing them before. The argument that greater economic growth will get us out of everything was just facetious. It didn't. You don't need enormous economic growth to get clean water. Clean water is not a really complicated technology. It's all about how you view different people. But yes, there's a danger that people do think I'm simply celebrating where we've got to. Where it's just saying something's altered. And don't ever believe anybody when they tell you that things are going faster than ever before, but it will never feel as slow again. Because of that observation, I believed that when I started writing this book. And I just tried to find the numbers that backed it up, and I couldn't.
Thank you so much. I think that was very important to say that, you know, even the World Bank today acknowledged the fact that there are inequalities and we suffer from them. Plenty of questions for you, really. So I'm going to try to capture all of them and read the first one. So I think the first one was from Olga. So Olga was asking you, what does deceleration mean for us and future generations? Does it mean slower progress or lack of progress? And will that have implication for the quality of life or perceived quality of life? It relates to what we were discussing already.
Yes. So if this carries on the way it's been going, we are very likely to live lives that are quite similar to our children's lives. Not as different as, if you're my age, as you lived your parents' lives or your grandparents. So our children will live in much the same houses and flats that we do. They'll have much the same technology. There'll be some changes, but not much. You will not get a new kind of teleporting machine. And although that sounds ridiculous, you'd have to be getting a teleporting machine in future to have the kind of technological change that our parents and grandparents saw. It could easily be beneficial. If you look at children in the United States, a majority of children in the United States now, if they're given a test that used to be applied in the 1950s to children, a majority turn out to be anxious and depressed and scared about the future. So this acceleration was not necessarily good in many ways that we had. It hasn't created a contented, happy population. It's created a very, very frightened population in those places which worshipped acceleration the most.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. So, more questions. Well, of course, I think it's a question everybody has in mind from Anne. Is this positive news for climate change?
Yes, well, just the alternative would have been really, really bad. So if GDP had actually been quietly accelerating for the last 60 decades, rather than decelerating but still rising, it would have been bad. And somehow we have managed to increase our pollution at an accelerating rate, even with GDP not accelerating. So we should look at that. The other really important thing for climate change is I think this shows that you can stop worrying about many other things. You know, those things that I showed accelerating, air flights, consumption of unnecessary goods by the rich. You know, it isn't impossible to say we could actually concentrate on this because you're not in an out of control world. The out of control part of the world is those things which are related to climate change and to CO2.
Absolutely. Another question, really interesting and related again from Nicola. Let me find a question again. Nicola was asking, what's the impact really on food in particular? Let me find the exact question. It was, I've written so many questions. I'm coming up with that. Yeah, foodstuff, access to food, and the quality and availability of a variety of foodstuff. Sorry, a question from Nicola.
Okay. I'm not, you know, I'm a geographer, so I skirt over things. Obviously, I don't know about nutrition and food very much. I do know that we produce as much food as we need, that some of us, me included, eat more than our fair share. And of course that we waste at least a third, and in some cases a half of it was eaten by rats. And also from the height data everywhere, we know, because height is related to nutrition, that human beings are again on average getting a variety of nutrition that they last got when they were hunter-gatherers, which is last when we had skeletons as tall as our children's skeletons will be. So human beings got shorter with farming because it was worse nutrition than hunter-gathering. We got to our shortest with factory living in Manchester and Liverpool, and then we've seen this incredible shooting up in just a few generations past all those events. We have enough food. We absolutely have enough food if we stop eating meat or eat far less meat. And there also are technological possibilities. I shouldn't say just because the rate of innovation is falling doesn't mean you may not get new innovations. So the one that gets people most excited is the growing of protein in labs in Helsinki without sunlight. You know, so there are still those kind of things to come. But food for a population that's not increasing in number in the future, food stops being the kind of issue that it has been for the last 2 centuries. And the main reason we get to 10 or 11 billion, by the way, isn't more births, and births are collapsing. It's people like me and you living longer. If life expectancy rises, the same number of people will mean more people at any one time on the planet, and more mouths to feed.
Excellent. I know from an international perspective that the right to food insists on the nutritious character of food. So that's very much what we're talking about. We have another question from Don. What position will depopulated countries like Scotland or Ireland find themselves in a slowdown situation? More opportunities or threats?
We're going to have to get so used to population in many areas beginning to fall. It's already falling in remote rural areas of Italy and Spain and Greece, Eastern Europe, already falling in Japan. So you have to look at those places and to think, how do you plan for that rather than trying to plan to stop it necessarily. The one thing I do think often about, well, somewhere like Scotland, I'm thinking about Glasgow. Glasgow, the population in the last 60 or 70 years halved, and one of the biggest depopulations on the planet is the city of Glasgow. And you've got a sunk infrastructure, a sewer system designed for a population twice what the city is now. So I would think about planning to try to prevent population declining too quickly in those places where you already have put the infrastructure in for a larger population. But that requires thinking about allowing people in, and we're not very good at allowing people in. I should also say on population growth, when people migrate, which on average is from a poor place to a richer place, they tend to have fewer children than if they'd stayed in the poor place. So the more migration you get in future, faster the population deceleration actually happens globally.
That's fascinating. It relates to politics, and that's the next question from Martin. What does this mean for politics, particularly if populist or neoliberal government act as though this is not happening?
Yes, I had a go at politics in the book. It's probably the weakest part of the book, although people might disagree and say other bits are weaker. And I drew some graphs for New York and London to try to get an idea of where they are headed and slow down in politics. My argument of politics is very crude, which is that the speed at which we've invented new kinds of politics has been slowing down. Socialism is very old. Anarchism is very old. Fascism is pretty old. The most recent new politics in terms of forming political parties were probably Green parties in the 1970s, ecological politics. But that was a peak in the 1970s. We're still left with these isms. Nobody's created a new one. And I'm not saying you have to, but just saying it's interesting. So if you look at someone that's slowed down a lot, Finland's one of my favourite examples of population slowdown. Finland is currently governed by 5 political parties. It's the Green Party, it's the Far Left Party, it's the Social Democrat Party. I should remember the Swedish Party, and I've gone and forgot one of them. But a coalition, if you like, of various kinds of old politics, all politics as old as I am, but creating something new. When it comes to populism, we're very good about being scared about it, which is good. But the fascism we have today is not like the fascism we had in the 1930s, not yet at least. The New York Times does a lovely graph every year, I don't know if they still update it, showing far right across Europe and whether it's rising or falling in each country. And in the last few years, when I look at that graph, I've noticed it's falling in more countries than it's rising. But we only report the rises. So I'm very scared when the far right rises in Austria. We don't tend to report when Golden Dawn disappears largely from Greece. We don't report when Le Pen does worse in France. We don't report when the AfD in Germany do worse. We don't report, for instance, at the European parliamentary level, that the European Parliament has recently benefited from losing 40 plus of the most right-wing of its MEPs. These were to the right of the EPP European Conservative bloc. This group was aligned in 2014 with Alternative for Deutschland. Those 40 plus MEPs were the UK Conservative and UKIP Brexit MEPs. Once those 40 MEPs had left the European Parliament, the far right of Europe only had Poland to turn to, and they're 21, I think, Law and Justice Party far right MEPs. So you have to be ever vigilant and worry, but the far right in Europe have just had a devastating fall in their power and support. Now, I'm not all, this is terrible. I'm not, and we're living in a country with some of the worst politics in all of Europe, some of the worst, most inept politicians. But if you look at those COVID curves, you look at the USA, you look at Brazil, You look at the UK at the top of them. There's hardly an advert for authoritarian populist leaders. They're not very good at controlling a disease. It's the kind of thing that your strong leader was supposed to be good at in the past. Whereas those countries which have dealt with COVID the best, them. Who's leading them? Often you don't know the name of their leaders, or if you do, it's disproportionately a woman. Not just a chance, but disproportionately, those countries in Europe which have coped better with this disease have been led by women and led by people who are not to the right politically.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that you want to go back to New Zealand?
New Zealand, but they had, New Zealand did have a geographical advantage, as did Finland. But and the story of COVID is mainly a story of good or bad luck. If the first tourist from China to have it had landed in Edinburgh, which they could have done, on New Year's Eve, which was theoretically possible, we'd be talking about the terrible disaster that befell Scotland. So we shouldn't read too much into this. But here's another way of putting it. Donald Trump is an abysmal leader, but I think he's no less stupid, possibly even a bit more clever than Ronald Reagan. And during the time of Ronald Reagan, we really did worry that we're all going to die. It was 3 minutes, 4 minutes to midnight on the nuclear clock. And it wasn't just that Ronald Reagan was capable of pressing the button, but there was a whole set of military personnel beneath him who would have carried it out. Now, with Donald Trump, for some reason, we don't worry so much about nuclear war. We still should, partly because we've got rid of 90% of nuclear warheads, but also we have some faith that even in the US, things have got better, and the chain of command beneath Trump wouldn't actually carry out all the orders. Now, it could be wrong, but I'm saying it's easy to get very depressed and say our politicians are completely useless. But if you decide you're going to measure it in some way, it is often a less depressing picture.
It's excellent advertisement for education, I think. So the more educated you are, the more informed, the better you understand the word. We have more questions. One from Gary. We have plenty of questions if you're not too tired, Danny. Gary, slightly more technical. Are you familiar with Mark Fisher's work on capitalism? And then, sorry, I lost the question because I have received more. So are you familiar with his work, and what do you think about it, basically?
I've read part of one of his the shorter book, I think, and I think he had a much less positive outlook than the one that I have.
The question, sorry to interrupt you, because the question is more precise. I found it. The slowdown may be broader. He argues that we are currently in a state of broader cultural paralysis, where there have been no breakthrough in art, etc. So indeed, it's a slightly different approach.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, on that, you can make a case that during the period of acceleration, and you can go right back to 1492 if you like, for acceleration, you can say there are a whole series of incredible changes in terms of art and culture. Or if you think about music and how music changed. Yes, because it's disruptive. Acceleration, change, enormous growth, rushing people into cities, leads to that. And he could be right about maybe not so many interesting, exciting cultural changes. But what you are getting, and this is the things we can't measure, we may be getting social changes that are faster than before. So I end the book talking about the Japanese royal family who have married out of the aristocracy for the first time in several millennia, and whose child, the emperor to come, goes to a school which is different from the ones that all the previous ones went to. And it's not just the Japanese royal family, it's many Japanese families. A cultural change in what it's okay to be like. Now that doesn't result in a kind of great era of new artists producing some wonderful paintings, but the future change could be individual freedoms to be who you want to be in families, and that's accelerating because other things are slowing down.
Really interesting. Related somehow, we have another question from Kat. Even if actual inventions peaked in the 30s, we seem to be more connected with each other on personal and global levels than ever in this digital age. What impact does it have on acceleration?
Um, that's a really interesting question. My argument is that the really stunning thing was the telephone and that ability, first of all, to talk to somebody else. So we could be doing a lot of this just on a telephone. It's quite nice to have the pictures and so on, but the change, the rate of change hasn't been so great. I had internet at university in 1986-87 and video conferencing at a very, very primitive level in 1990. Um, so it's, we get changes, Zoom can do several hundred people, but it's not at the rate of change that we had before. People used to say it made possible was it made migration possible. It's much easier to migrate from one country to another if you know you could contact home easily, and if you knew you could get home easily, if there was a cheap air ticket if you wanted to see a relative. Um, and it may well still do that. We'll have to see uh, in the future to come. But we shouldn't expect our children to be using technology which is that much different from this that we're using now. Because when I was almost a child and I was very nerdy, we had it then. And what we don't have are multiple screens around our room. What we don't have is people sitting around as little 3D holograms. Uh, it's I'm trying to give people tell you that they've created a great new innovation, and there isn't a measure against it. So last year at a tech fair, the great innovation with mobile phones was a phone that you could bend slightly. Now, it's very hard to make a phone that you can bend and the screen will bend, but it isn't that useful. Um,
Right. We have a few more questions. Is that all right for you? And
yeah, yeah.
all right, you're there. So we have a really interesting as well. I mean, provocative question from Davy. In your opinion, should we be doing anything to prevent the slowdown? And if so, why?
Um, I don't, well, no, I don't think so in general, and particularly the slowdown as it relates to material goods. Um, but we should worry if the slowdown stops us doing things which are creative and which don't create more carbon, but make people happier and keep an economy moving. So we should try and actually apply some discernment um, to the slowdown and work out what do we want to. But also, we had got to a ridiculous stage where we were working stupid numbers of hours to produce more things than we possibly needed, which we then had to create new forms of advertisement. So newspapers go bust because they couldn't throw enough adverts at you. So you have to have Facebook because it's adverts to get you to buy things that you don't need. We really had got to a ridiculous level of overconsumption that wasn't making us happy. Now, the pandemic makes it much easier to see that. People will know what they haven't bought. People will also know what they really miss and what they haven't missed. And it allows you to value. So I would use the pandemic to work out what it is that has slowed down that you don't like slowing down. But please don't forget what it is about slowing down that you've actually enjoyed.
I understand. So it relates again. We have a question. It might be the last one, really, from Curtis. I hope people are not going to be frustrated. But are government planning for slowdown? For example, how societies with, say, reducing population and lower GDP will fund themselves, or is this something that is assumed will take care of itself?
Things don't take care of themselves well if you don't pay attention to them. It's what I'd say. So those countries which have slowed down ahead of time, places like Japan, like Scandinavia, where the population levels have dropped faster, they also tend to be places that plan more. So they've planned public transport systems. They've planned for how you deal with a much bigger elderly population. The elderly population of Finland and Japan, as a proportion, is much higher than the elderly population of the UK and the USA. So I don't think you can leave it, because those countries that have slowed down first and more are countries where people tend to plan more, and certainly don't leave things to the market to sort out. The idea that the market will create some happy outcome, just that was a stupid idea for the time of the acceleration. That idea is dead.
Really, really interesting. All right, that's really the last one. And you have to know that the Royal Geographical Society thanks you for a really interesting conversation. But the last question, because I don't want anybody to be frustrated. So we have Pevre who asks, will the rate of the slowdown of various metrics when compared with each other end up determining whether inequality increases or decreases? Is it about comparing slowdown rates?
It's about comparing slowdown rates and looking very carefully at inequality, because it is possible that inequality, although vast, but it varies greatly between places, inequality has, for the majority of the last 5 or 6 years, in terms of income, been falling in more OECD countries than it's been rising. We don't often report potential good news stories like that. It's a very small reduction. However, we've just entered a period where by far the biggest drops in wealth have been for those who've had the most wealth. People without wealth can't lose wealth at all. So we potentially, rather like the First World War, but without the other effects, we potentially just gone through a period of massive wealth equalisation. It all depends what's happened to the housing market and what people will pay. But before the pandemic, there was a slight increase in equality in the majority of OECD countries, others like the UK becoming more unequal. The pandemic has really reset things greatly, but we should remember that we were on a trajectory before to becoming more equal in more places, because there's a limit to how long you can carry on letting a small number of people get richer and richer and richer, and tell the majority of people they've just got to work harder, and they watch other people being more and more greedy.
Yeah. Well, I hope a number of political leaders are hearing you, and indeed this could be put in place. Well, I think that was the last question. Thank you so much, Danny. That was fascinating. We had a great conversation with our audience. Thanks very much to everyone for joining. And thanks as well to the team, Marika, Olga, Andy, and her in particular for supporting the organization of this webinar. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you all very soon, next week, same place, same time.